Hello, welcome, and thank you for being a part of WorkSafe's webinar, Psychosocial Hazard Fundamentals. My name is Cameron Ling, and I'll be your host for this session. And this morning, we will explore the following key topics: what psychosocial hazards look like in the workplace, the impacts of psychosocial hazards, especially when they accumulate over time or interact with each other, how managing psychosocial hazards follows the same structured risk management cycle used for physical safety risks. Now, I'm sure we all know the Victorian government has confirmed new psychological health regulations that will be introduced by the end of the year. Earlier this week, we held a webinar on this topic. If you did miss that one, I would encourage you to watch the recording that will be available in a few weeks' time. Our session today is an introduction to the topic of psychosocial hazards and won't focus on the specifics of the psych regulations. Today, I am joined by Principal Psychologist with Psych Group Training and Advisory, Sarah Helwidge. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning, Cameron. Thanks for having me, and welcome everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you with us. We will be taking some audience questions in a little bit, but please feel free. If you've got a question ready to go, you can put that in there at any time. Could we start, Sarah, by asking you to explain what psychosocial hazards are?
Yeah, great question, Cameron. So psychosocial hazards are factors and they're related to work design. So this is referring to daily tasks, responsibilities and expectations of a role, and also how our roles are structured within an organisation. Also around our systems of work, and this is our policies, procedures, practices that guide our business operations. Management of work, so thinking about the way that our work is planned, procured and resourced. How work is carried out, so this is related to where we do our work and how we perform our work. Also thinking about things like shift work and working from home, and then workplace interactions. So this is how employees interact with each other and support each other, and also support our clients and community. So when we think about these and how employees are exposed to psychosocial hazards, there's a combination of hazards within every workplace.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that, Sarah. I was wondering, could you expand by giving us some examples of what psychosocial hazards look like in the workplace?
Yeah, so some psychosocial hazards might be present all the time. So if we think about environments like customer service facing environments, we think about retail, emergency services, community and social services. So they might encounter occupational violence and aggression or exposure to trauma more regularly than other professions. And then other hazards might, arise and emerge from poor work design or systems of work. So thinking about things like the way that roles are designed without a person in mind, or structured in a way that roles are confusing or create barriers to getting the job done. So this can lead to things like high job demands, low job control and low role clarity. Or even aspects such as poorly managed change, so where there might be a new system or process designed and implemented without staff consultation, or where staff haven't been provided with the right information or training on how to implement that new system effectively. This can lead to poor role clarity and higher job demands for a period. Or lastly, inappropriate behaviours such as bullying or harassment that the person or the victim perceives as not handled respectfully or fairly. This can lead to experiences of poor organisational justice.
So why is it so important that we're aware of psychosocial hazards in the workplace?
Yeah, so I think when psychosocial hazards are present, and like I've just mentioned, they're present and they are inherent to certain roles. So when workers are exposed to one or more hazards frequently and over a long period of time, this can lead to negative psychological responses. So changes in our thinking, our emotions and our behaviours, and also our physiology. So examples might include, changes in the way, our concentration, or excessive worry, or emotional irritability or heightened sensitivity, or things like our behaviour, so changes in our attendance patterns or desire to withdraw and isolate. or then our physiological changes such as heart palpitations, panic, stomach upset, headaches, and muscle tension. So it's important to recognise that, not all individuals will experience psychosocial hazards in the same way. For example, some workers might thrive under pressure and tolerate low levels of clarity, but others might experience the same conditions as extremely stressful. And this can lead to negative psychological and physiological responses, like I just mentioned. So this is where it's really important to consult regularly with workers, listen to them, and understand their experiences at work.
So when we compare physical to psychosocial hazards, does the risk management approach differ?
No. So a really good question, and this is something that comes up quite regularly. So really, it's the same structured risk management cycle that we use for physical health and safety. So it begins with identifying the hazards. So what hazards might be present, and this is through observations, like I mentioned, listening to staff, understanding what they're saying, reviewing incident report data, or even through our structured surveys. And then once identified, the next step is to consider who's exposed and to which hazards and over how long. So how frequent and for how long have they been exposed to these hazards? And from there, it's around implementing controls to either eliminate in the first instance where reasonably practicable, or minimising the risk to those that are exposed. And then once those controls are implemented, it's that process of monitoring and reviewing to checking back in to seeing, have the controls that we've implemented reduced the risk so far as reasonably practicable? And again, the key here is consultation with our workers. So across the whole life cycle of that risk management process, it's really talking to employees and understanding their experience.
I wonder, Sarah, perhaps have you got an example of how psychosocial hazards play out in the workplace?
Yeah, so I guess let's take for an example a community support worker. So she joins a community service organisation during a busy period, and due to resourcing constraints, she's only received a brief induction. Immediately, she's exposed to a high caseload of clients with complex needs, and she's also required to implement case notes into a very complicated administrative program. In addition to this, she's required to do off-site visits, and she hasn't been taught the emergency escalation process. And lastly, a manager who's also exposed to, these high pressures and is unavailable for that kind of real-time support. So this worker, for example, might find that only after a couple of months in the role that they might be experiencing some anxiety about coming to work in that environment, maybe second guessing themselves after each shift, and maybe experiencing some headaches or muscle tension as a result of that. So if we think about that example, the psychosocial hazards present are low role clarity due to that brief induction, high job demands, that expectation to get across complex clients and also navigating that complex administrative process, remote and isolated work. So this worker's working in isolation and visiting clients on site. And then also the poor support. So the poor induction, also coupled with the low supervisory support due to those increased overall burdens that they're both experiencing. So as a result here, we're seeing some early signs of psychological harm for this worker and, a cluster of psychosocial hazards occurring there.
Right. So in terms of psychosocial risk management, what could the workplace do in this example you've presented?
Yeah, so, this is a very common problem for workers like this, a system that's under pressure. So they're commonly experiencing, these demands. So for servicing people in this environment, it's really thinking about where we can't induct people or where our supervisors are under pressure as well. Can we improve our clarity by putting together, for example, brief induction manuals that get the new worker across administrative systems and processes and also support people in the event of emergencies? And whereas supervisor support might be limited due to their high job demands, is there a way of creating a team infrastructure of support? So it's a sort of a buddy support system. And so while the support person might change, ideally that worker knows who's their support person is on any given shift. Also thinking about things like, is there a way to have a way that staff post their needs in real time and receive feedback? So a staff forum, we think about those types of mechanisms. Also escalation processes and people, it's critical. So potentially, where that person's working in a remote and isolated working environment, how can they receive that supervisor support or a dedicated third-party service? So we think about those de-escalation and duress alarms and who those real-time supports are.
Yeah. A great example. Thank you so much for that one, Sarah. Have you got another one for us?
Yeah, so another one might be, for example, a criminal lawyer working on a high-profile child sexual abuse case, right? So this is where a worker in this instance might be exposed to highly distressing case material, and that's not only including the review of content, but also maybe imagery about this particular case. In this environment, long working hours are the norm, so staying back after scheduled work is an unspoken expectation. And then also the work culture. So, largely disconnected, their colleagues are keeping to themselves, resulting in little informal interaction and peer support. So over time, this lawyer might be experiencing psychological harm, maybe some sleep disturbance with the material replaying over in their head. Maybe the association between work and family start to blur, so some paranoia about their own children linked to the same material that they might be reviewing. So this experience might be leading to increased anxiety for that lawyer and maybe even a decline in confidence. So thoughts of, I'm not cut out for this. Why can't I manage like everyone else? I just need to get a grip. And these are very common experiences. And unfortunately, this type of thinking leads to lowered help seeking as well.
So, Sarah, what are the key psychosocial hazards in that scenario you're presenting?
Yeah, so that scenario is really talking to exposure to trauma, but the vicarious trauma, because of that, not that direct trauma, but trauma that comes through the content and material that they're reviewing. Also high job demands, so the high workloads being a norm in that case, and that poor support through the culture and the interactions and not that proactive support-seeking culture.
And continuing on from that, Sarah, what could the workplace do to reduce this risk?
Yeah, so for these environments, it's really thinking about how do we, given that trauma is an inherent risk here, how do we build in trauma-informed policies and protocols? So this is around, giving people information around reviewing traumatic content and material and helping staff to understand those risks. So what signs to look out for in themselves and where to go when they're experiencing any early signs of distress. And I think here critically is the supervisory support. So it's not just about managing the workload, it's checking in with the person on their emotional impact of the work and placing early supports in place that the worker themselves find meaningful. And in addition, I think really important is the option for rotating out of high impact cases. So if there's, especially when that work starts to affect someone's psychological health, and it's really giving the employee choice over their exposure, it can be an extremely protective factor. And lastly, clinical support, always really important, particularly where you're starting to see these early signs of distress after trauma exposure.
You've given us a couple of really important examples already, but perhaps could you give us another example of a hazard in a small business and an effective risk control?
Sure. So let's think about a pizza shop. A new employee begins their first shift in a busy Friday night at the local pizza shop. Again, receive very minimal induction, no clear guidance on how to use their point of sale system, and also managing or how to manage difficult customers. So potentially during this shift, they might be exposed to challenging and aggressive customers due to long wait times, errors in the point of sale system, and feeling really unprepared how to manage that. So if we think about the hazards here, it's low role clarity and also exposure to aggression and violence. So if we think,
sorry,
Ken.
No, please keep going.
So if we think about the controls there, it's really, a customer aggression protocol. So how do we train staff quickly on how to de-escalate those customers and calm? And so not only calm phrases for themselves, but how do they interact with the customer calmly? And maybe even, there's safety exits if needed. We also think about things like a point of sale quick reference guide. So how do they, learn that system on the go? And managerial check-ins, so before and after shifts, what support is needed. And lastly, and I think most importantly, work design opportunities. So in small business, this is still possible. So inviting staff around how to shape their roles. How do they think about de-escalating staff? What are their improvements that they would feel beneficial in that type of environment, and how do they, I guess, support their own working environment by giving their own feedback?
If we could perhaps expand on that a little bit, what control measures could be implemented in a workplace like this?
Yeah, so I think just as I mentioned there, it's really around providing that choice to employees. So giving them the opportunity to come in and reflect. So if you think about after a busy night shift like that, it might be bringing the team together in a team huddle and checking in not only on how people are feeling, how did the night go, but also really thinking about, well, what could we do next time? So if things went wrong, if things went awry, how does that then lead us to build in those worker support? So it might be, do they need more training on de-escalation? Is there that point of sale quick reference guide that could be put together? So by asking our team, what they need for support, it's really a great way to initiate those types of interventions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. The points you've raised in those terrific examples have given us some great food for thought. Before we open up to the questions from our audience, I've got a video to play that summarises some of Sarah's key points around psychosocial hazards and what a healthy workplace looks like.
Psychological health is our state of well-being that affects the way we think and feel and act.
Employers have legal responsibilities to protect their employees' psychological health at work. Generally, when we think about workplace safety, our minds automatically revert to physical safety.
Psychological health is just as important as physical health.
Reducing psychological harm benefits everyone in Victorian workplaces.
Psychosocial hazards can be present in workplaces in many ways, and they can include things like bullying, sexual harassment, aggression and violence, poor support, and high job demands.
Psychosocial hazards are factors in the design, management, systems, carrying out, or social aspects of the work that can cause physical and psychological harm, such as excessive worrying, difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, or feelings of isolation.
It can also present in very physical ways, like headaches, stomach aches, and increased heart rate.
Psychosocial hazards can combine and interact, which increases the risk of harm. When psychological harm continues over an extended period of time, it can lead to psychological injuries, such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. There is no industry, workplace, or role that's free from psychosocial hazards. A psychologically healthy workplace is one that actively works to prevent harm. They're usually the workplaces that are frequently talking to their employees, because employees can be your best source of information.
For years, we've understood the importance of physically safe workplaces. The next step is to ask yourself whether your workplace is psychologically healthy and safe. Visit our website for practical resources and information.
That really highlights what a psychologically health and safe workplace is. Perhaps a good one to share with your team back in your own workplace. Sarah, I'd love to get to some questions now from the audience. We've got a lot coming in, and I'll try to get to as many as I possibly can. This first one, a lot of people wanting the answer to, and no doubt a really tricky one for us to kick off with. Sarah, how should we manage psychosocial risks when stress or verbal aggression comes from senior management and staff are too scared to speak up?
Yeah, look, that's a really great question. And I think, it's around how do we bring a collective voice together? So really appreciating that, psychosocial hazards are now an employer's responsibility to control. So, there is a legal obligation and a legal duty for, the elimination of these hazards. So violence and aggression is one such hazard. So it's really important to bring this to the attention of the employer and making sure that there is a zero tolerance for these type of behaviours. And I know that that can be really difficult in workplaces. So, where there is that fear to speak up, again, we talk really around psychological safety, the perception of employees with their, ability to be able to speak up around things that don't feel safe at work. So I encourage, safe reporting. So it might be through your health and safety representative that they can then speak on your behalf, or thinking about your human resource business partner, or even in those smaller businesses, it's really thinking, who can those support people be? Is it someone else in a management role, or even another senior employee that feels safer to speak to, that might be able to escalate on your behalf potentially?
Yeah, great point. Thank you for that, Sarah. This next one, again, a lot of people wanting the answer to. How do we differentiate from personal psychosocial stress to workplace psychosocial stress, from pre-employment process throughout the employment tenure?
Yeah, so I think, when we talk about psychological health and safety, our psychological health is going to be impacted by our personal life and our work life. And when it comes to our employer, they have an obligation to provide a safe workplace. And that means the reduction or minimising the impact of psychosocial hazards, or eliminating, where possible in the first instance. So that's what the employer has control over. And I guess the employee needs to be able to bring to the attention of the employer the psychosocial hazards that they're exposed to, for them to be able to do something meaningful about it. When it comes to our own psychological health outside of work, we do have a responsibility for that in our own account. So it's really around thinking, how do we maintain our own health and well-being to bring our best self to work? So thinking about, diet, sleep, exercise, and a good, medical professionals. So really thinking about, proactively seeking support if you are experiencing stress, that's resulting from our own personal experiences. It's getting that early support that we need to bolster and support our health and safety.
Great, Sarah. This next question, it's a tricky one, because they're not psychosocial hazards are not necessarily quantifiable. So the question is, we know what psychosocial hazards are, but how exactly are they measured? Are there guidelines, or is it a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, look, we do a risk, there is a risk management process, and it's really thinking around the frequency. So how often are people exposed, and for how long? Because we know there's a relationship between, it's like a dose by dose basis, and in very simple terms, like a bucket filling up with water. So the more frequent and for a longer period of time, we're likely, and we know that we see more psychological injuries as a result of that. So frequency and duration are very much aligned with the risk matrices when we think about psychosocial risk management. But also, I think, critical incidents, and we think about people with that might bring their own experience, and we think about environments like, for example, community services. People that work in those environments often work for those work organisations because they come with their own, perhaps history, and then they want to make a difference to the lives of others. So there might be that, pre-exposure, prior to then coming into that role. So I think, really proactive conversations around that, around what are your triggers? What are your signs? How do we know when we need to support you? How do you know when you need support from us? So I think having those transparent and open conversations with staff is a really protective thing to do.
Great, thank you, Sarah. This next one, a lot of people wanting the answer to, and I feel it's coming from either employer or management lens. How can we make sure workers/employees know the difference between psychosocial hazards and normal duties or normal circumstances, such as constructive feedback?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. So I think first and foremost, and I'll just come back to, employer duties, it's around providing our supervisors with the right skills. So often supervisors are promoted on technical skills and not interpersonal skills. So I think if we set our leaders up for success in terms of giving them really good interpersonal skills and how to have constructive and safe and meaningful conversations, then feedback is just a necessary and normal part of any role. And in actual fact, we need feedback. But the way that feedback is given is, it can be really protective and supportive and bolster our, performance at work, but it also can be quite punitive and have the opposite effect. So I think, I'd come back to that, giving our leaders the right skills to provide that feedback. And then obviously, performance discussions are a very normal and reasonable part of any management infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Again, a lot of people and so many are getting involved here, so really appreciate that from our audience. Does the obligation to manage psychological health increase if we know of employee diagnosis of things like depression, anxiety, alcohol dependency, etc.?
Yeah, another really great question. So, I think we know that when we move through life, we're going to be exposed to and experience stressors. Like, we're bringing human beings to work, and human beings experience, different pressures outside of work. Can we provide a workplace that is, really protective, really safe, where they can flourish and thrive at work? Yes, we can if we manage hazards really well and we provide that good infrastructure. So where someone might be experiencing depression and anxiety from outside circumstances, can we encourage them to get support? Can we make sure that we're giving them any flexibility that we might need to manage those circumstances? Right, and to be able to then come to work and flourish and get through personal circumstances. But if the work is causing the anxiety and depression, that's psychosocial risk management. So that's where we need to get really good at listening and hearing about those work-related pressures and stresses and understanding, can we turn those levers and dials to manage those psychosocial hazards for the individual, for them to be able to, again, thrive at work.
This next question, Sarah, might relate a little bit to that answer you gave there around the workplace hazards. As all employees have different expectations in the workplace, how is the employer expected to cater for all personalities?
A good question. And I think, back to the risk management cycle, identify, assess, control, monitor, review, and around that cycle is consultation. So I appreciate that question might be coming with a little bit of that, how do we possibly do this? How do we possibly get to know every single employee? And I think it comes back to the way that we upskill our leaders to be able to have regular and routine conversations with our employees, and also being acutely aware of our organisational risks and, not only inherent risks that pose as part of our work, but also, is there impending change coming? Do we need to support our teams for success? Who's the change going to impact? So doing, kind of our proactive psychosocial risk management exercises, we're going to be able to then put those supports in place even before people are coming to us and saying we're struggling. But in the event that they are, it's listening and making kind of real-time supports as well. So it doesn't need to be overcomplicated or overcooked. It's just a matter of listening and really kind of taking that proactive intervention on an as-needs basis.
Great. We're getting lots of great questions here, and some really good challenging ones as well. And I'll ask this one on behalf of a lot of people wanting the answer to it. If we already have compressive policy and procedures with regards to OHS, including bullying, harassment, discrimination, do we need to do new consultation with employees?
I think, when it comes to our policies and procedures, they're really only as good as the paper they're written on unless we implement them, in safe practices. So something that's been coming up quite a bit recently is, do our bullying and harassment policies and procedures, do they come with a person-centered lens? So when we're putting someone through, disciplinary action, are we doing so in a safe and supportive way? Are we giving the person choice over, where the conversation is had, how the conversation is had? If they need to pause for a break, do they bring a support person? Providing really thorough and good communication throughout the process and navigating that process, by putting ourselves in that person's shoes. So I don't know if I'm answering the question specifically, but it's really around policies and procedures and consultation, when they, obviously when we're developing a new policy and procedure, absolutely. If there is a change and making sure that we're consulting. But I think also just really good application of the policies and procedures in terms of bringing them to life and bringing them to life in a person-centered way is really good practice.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. This next one, how is the reasonableness of psychosocial task demands assessed in the workplace?
I'm not sure if I fully understand that question. I might give it a go. Look, I think the earlier example I used around job demands, right? So employees will experience hazards differently. So if you think about, high job demands for one person, really high workload, having to make, sort of having to pivot between talking to people and then going back to sort of administrative duties, they might really thrive in that environment. But the other person might be really experiencing, the same role as really, hazardous or particularly stressful. So it's really thinking around creating a two-way mechanism for feedback, making sure that that person is able to speak up if that work environment is posing too much of a challenge for them, and then making sure that we're able to sort of adjust and tweak accordingly. Appreciating that we are working in busy workplaces. There are demands, there are pressures. And I think really, where we can't eliminate those hazards, how can we increase those protective factors? So how can we increase support? How can we increase job control? And so really when people have got the perception of support and control and clarity, they can really offset and enhance some of those, inherent, demands, if that's where the question was coming from.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Sarah. And this next question might be along that same theme, and you've possibly answered a little bit of it already, but I will ask it in case you've got anything else to expand on. How can we provide a psychosocially safe environment for staff when they are required to work in physically, socially, and emotionally stressful environments?
Yeah, so another concept is psychological safety. Right. So this is, the environment where staff feel safe to speak up, where they feel that when they bring an idea to work, that it will be taken on board and really considered in terms of protective factors, where they're not going to be, treated differently for raising a safety concern. So these, if we can cultivate these environments of safety, where staff are coming together, collaborating. So if something goes wrong, we're not kind of punishing people, we're bringing them to the table and getting creative around solutions. Those types of work environments where we're under extreme pressures where we can really, again, yes, I have sort of answered it, bolster and really increase those protective factors and cultivate a culture of safety, that can drive really great outcomes, not only for protective, but also for our community and clients that we're servicing as well.
Great, thanks for that, Sarah. This one just, I think even flowing on again, but asking for some practical help. What are some practical ways that supervisors can proactively embed psychological safety in the workplace?
Great question. So I think here it's around regular and routine opportunities of engaging and talking to staff. I think it's normalizing a conversation around not necessarily not coping, but not doing as well as what we could be. So, one example that I used while working during COVID was on a scale of 1 to 5, how are we doing today? So really practical, I'm a 3 and I'm a 3 because, or I'm a 5 and I'm a 5 because. So it's kind of this opportunity to share. And when we say because, it might be allowing people to say, there's stuff going on at home, or allowing people to say, yesterday I dealt with a really difficult, interaction with a customer. It got to me, it felt like this. And then it's an opportunity for the group to really kind of think about, okay, well, what interventions do we need? So, that I think those supervisors in isolation don't need to come up with all the solutions themselves. Workers are often really well placed to then build, the designs and the interventions that are going to support them in the workplace. So I encourage regular communication, normalising health and safety concerns, and also decreasing stigma around not doing so well. It's okay to not do so well. It doesn't need to be, swept under the rug. The more we normalise conversations around our health and safety at work, the better the workplace can be for everyone.
A little earlier, Sarah, you mentioned HSRs, and this next question relates to that. What tips do you have for health and safety representatives, or HSRs, tackling emerging hazards in the workplace? There's then a statement from the person asking the question. I have the feeling employers will push back.
Yeah, look, and again, that's probably those work environments where those HSRs are working and they're feeling like that. I just encourage you to continue to move forward. I think in terms of, how do we bring everyone along on the journey together? It's through good information, it's through good education. So I think for HSRs, really getting across, and I've printed out my own copy of the Code of Practice, getting across it, reading it. It's got some wonderful practical tips in there and resources. So I think, when we communicate, with confidence, and also we, have some really practical strategies for employers to come on board with us, we can get some really good traction. And, your role as a HSR, really important role, and particularly important for those workplaces where people, feel that you are the safe person to come to and advocate on their behalf. So, I think good information and good communication are really key skills when we want to kind of bring people along on this journey.
This next question, Sarah, relates to change in the workplace. If a new manager that has a different approach in their leadership style that perhaps could be seen as bullying, leading to employee anxiety and stress, is this a risk?
Well, I think we're talking about a couple of things there, aren't we? Organisational change management, in itself is an inherent hazard, right? Because you're changing things, you're changing management, you're changing, potential. So that in itself is a change, and how that manager communicates and what that manager needs from you and how you kind of work together. And if there is a change and it hasn't been, I guess, implemented well in terms of ways of working and communicating with that new manager, and then the person's perceiving that new manager as, bullying, I guess, interactions, it's really important, I think, in the first instance, in having a clear and open conversation where it feels safe to do so with that manager, and really kind of saying, look, the way that, your interactions or the way that I'm feeling around your interactions feel like this, and I wonder if we could, it's always coming with a solution, I think, is the first recommendation, and having that informal conversation with that person. And where you've tried that and that might fail, it's then kind of potentially getting some advice from your HR business partner or your HSR or another trusted colleague around how to have a conversation. And then obviously thinking about those escalation points. If you've tried and exhausted all options, obviously there are, those escalation points internally in terms of incident reporting systems, and HR kind of mechanisms for intervention.
A little earlier, Sarah, you mentioned working from home during COVID. This one's more working from home in general. With work from home, how does psychosocial come into play when this occurs? Are the controls the same?
Yes, in most instances they are. I mean, our employer has a duty of care for us, and that's depending on, whether we're working from home, whether we're working remotely and interacting with community, or we're working from an office. The hazards are the same. I think they become a little bit more complex if you think about the home environment and blurring the boundaries between, work and home. But really, if we think about when we come to work, regardless of what's going on at home, if our work is a really safe and supportive place, we can feel motivated, engaged, productive, good hazard management, good support from leaders, really good role clarity, a locus of control over our work and the way that we do our work, good change management. These can buffer and support us. So no, the risks, in terms of the hazard management and the responsibilities, they don't differ from a person working at home. I think we need to be more astute around those that are working from home and what supports they need, and really bolstering all of those supports and thinking about how we communicate regularly and support staff. So there is that connectedness and inclusion. But yeah, it's not the same. It's one, collective responsibility.
Sarah, a couple of times you've touched on the different personalities at play in any workplace. This one is no doubt a tough one with that. Trauma has so many levels. One person's major blip is another's brush off. How do you define where intervention is needed?
So I suspect that question might be related to interpersonal conflict resulting potentially in a trauma response for an individual. And I'm not too sure how to answer that, without knowing any kind of full context or detail of that. But I think it's around, understanding and expressing how an interaction or experience is impacting you psychologically. So if we think about that risk management cycle, employers have an obligation to regularly review risk, but you as an employee, you have that voice too, and that opportunity to be able to take your experience, think about that exposure and how that's showing up for you, and communicating that back in a way that's going to be meaningful. An example might be, the way that you spoke to me yesterday, it actually made me feel quite overwhelmed. And afterwards, I had a little bit of a, trauma response in the fact that I kept replaying it over and over and over in my mind. And I wonder if we could talk about that, because I'd really like for that not to happen again. So it's not the magic answer. I probably might not understand that the context of that question, but hopefully that sheds some light.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Sarah. We've probably run out of time. Unfortunately, we've had so many questions and so many more to come. I do apologise to all those people whose questions I couldn't get to. The engagement from the audience has been outstanding, and obviously so many people wanting to know more information on this particular topic. Sarah, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise today.
You're welcome, Cameron, and thank you so much for joining, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, we hope that everybody who has joined us today has found this an interesting and informative session. This webinar will be available via the WorkSafe's website from next month if you would like to go back and replay any of it. We do value your opinion on our Health and Safety Month events, so soon we'll be sending you an online survey. We would love it if you could provide your feedback so that we can incorporate your suggestions in our program next year. All respondents will go into the draw to win one of 5 $100 gift cards. Shortly, you'll see on screen a list of all the programs that we have covered today. If you require any further information, we do recommend that you head to WorkSafe's website, or if you can't find what you need there, please, there is also the WorkSafe advisory line, so please use that, or in an emergency, there is the emergency line. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar.